Welcome to another tutorial. Today we will be going over Slitscan animation using a flatbed scanner. So, starting things off, I'm going to go over what it means to scan something. So, to scan as a verb means to look at all the parts carefully or to cause an object to be traversed by a detector, which what it's saying is you're taking an object and breaking it down into smaller pieces to either observe it in a way that is easier to understand or to have less information at a given point in time and then combine it later on to create a more whole sort of definition. Now we'll talk about what a flatbed scanner is. A flatbed scanner is the probably most common type of scanner that you're going to come across, and it means that it has a bed area that is flat and the object stays stationary as a sensor moves across. So it's not recording the entire object at once, it's taking it in slice by slice by slice, but the object typically would stay stationary. And so if you were to have an object that you were trying to record, you would just be recording it piece by piece by piece by piece by piece by piece by piece as all of these individual slices, and then it's compiled after the fact and you're presented with a full object. Now let's talk about what Slitscan means. Slitscan is really only used to specifically refer to photography where you don't expose the entire photo at once, and traditionally it would be you'd have a mechanism in front of the lens that would move along, and you would have a time difference between the first section that you're exposing and the next section and the next section and the next section, but Slitscan specifically is referring to photography. It sort of functions like if you have an iPhone, what a panorama does. It's not photographing the whole thing at once, it's taking it slice by slice by slice. It's essentially scanning the environment. So now let's talk about how you can manipulate an image that is being scanned, because it's not being recorded all at once, it's being recorded in those slices that we were talking about. So I'm going to take this graphic and I'm going to cut it up into some slices. So typically if you were using a flatbed scanner, this would be staying stationary and you'd move it along, and all of these slices would remain in place and the final image would be of what you're seeing. But if you move the object while it's scanning, those slices can be readjusted. I'm going to turn this. So if you're scanning and the sensor on the scanner, the flatbed scanner, is moving in this direction, you can sort of imagine that these are pretty low fidelity slices of the object as it's scanning along. If it's stationary, it looks exactly the same, but you can manipulate those slices. Let's imagine that you have this object on a flatbed scanner and you leave it stationary and you're just left with this basic, the same design. It doesn't distort in any way. But let's say that you move the object as it's scanning. What's going to happen is that sensor, as it's moving down, it's going to record elements multiple times and you'll have an elongated form that has repeating elements. So if this was scanning and you were moving it, these slices would be recorded over a longer period of time and you get this elongation. As a contrast, if you were to take this object and move it against the direction of the scanner sensor as it was moving, you would get a condensed looking object where you're removing information. I'm going to do this with tweezers. You can imagine that it then condenses the object and you're left with a squashed appearance of something, whatever you're scanning. This is a very low fidelity thing, but a more tactile way to approach and understand it. And so it's squashed because you're omitting information, because you're taking those slices and you're moving against the scanner. You can also take this object and move it perpendicular to the direction of the scanner's motion, of the sensor motion, in which case you'll get a distorted object. If you're moving it to the right, you're changing the position as it's recording the information and offsetting it to the right, and you end up with a skewed object. And in this case, you would have it would end up being something more like this. And you have a skewed object, and if you move it to the left, it would be skewed in the opposite direction. Those are just a few basic movements that you can do while that scanner is moving, but you can also combine them. So let's say that you moved it this direction and in the opposite direction, you'd end up with a sort of a C pattern, or like a angular thing in that direction. Or if you moved it down as you were doing that as well, you'd elongate in this way, and then you can create a number of different abstracted versions of that same object. Something like that even, where you move in this direction, then down, and then over to the side. Now let's talk about how this can be used for animation. When you're animating something, what you're doing is you are slightly changing the position or attributes of an object and then playing back those changes in sequence. So in this case, you'd have this object appear to elongate this way. How you can use this within the instance of the Slitscan, or using the flatbed scanner to do Slitscan stuff, is you increase the amount of movement in an understood manner, and then you take those scans, those distortions, and you play them back in sequence, and it appears to be moving. How animation works. So let's get some experience of this using an actual flatbed scanner as opposed to this more physical, low fidelity version of it. So what I'll be using to illustrate these distortions and then subsequent animation is the same design that I cut up before, but printed on both sides of a piece of cardstock. I'm going to be mirroring these scans in post so that you can see how the movement is affecting the final scan image. But if you're doing this on your own, know that when you're scanning something, the sensor is underneath the glass. So it's getting a completely different perspective from what you're seeing above. If you were scanning like this drawing right here, it would appear this way only when it's placed face down on the scanner. So what you're seeing from above is completely different from what the sensor is picking up on the reverse. So if you're trying to mimic this tutorial, don't have your object facing up. This is just a visual aid for the tutorial. So what I'm going to do is mimic those examples that I gave using the actual scanner so you can see them, and then I'll do a probably time-lapse that's version of the actual animation. So first things first, I'm just going to scan this directly across, no movement at all, and it'll show the same thing that you're seeing on the reverse, on the front. And just as a reminder, this will be mirrored in post for when it's showing the scan following along with this sensor bar. There's going to be some pauses in this process. Okay, so if you recall the first example that I showed with the physical version was moving in the direction of the scanner, and what you have is all of these slices going along, and it'll elongate the form. So let's move in the direction that it's going, trying to keep it generally as straight as possible, but you'll see some inconsistencies, which is part of the appeal and just the process itself. At least for me, are those sort of touches of human error. So now you'll be able to see the elongated form that happens because you're moving faster than the scan, or you're moving in the direction, so you're repeating information that the scanner is picking up. So now I'm going to start slightly further down so that I can move against the direction of the scanner and collapse the image. So I'm going to wait for it to hit this front edge, and then I'm just going to start moving. So now let's move. And once the scanner has passed whatever position you're in, it's not going to pick up anything on this side of the scan bar, of the sensor. Now let's do the same thing again, but instead we're going to move in this direction. And it will be skewed, so this top section will be in here, and then as it moves along, it'll sort of skew in that direction. And now we'll do the opposite direction, and you can see how the distortion takes hold in that way. Give it a moment. And now you can see how it's skewed in the opposite way that it was prior. Now let's combine those and go. I'm going to combine the elongation and the skewing. So I'm going to move in one direction and pull sort of diagonally. And then I'm going to just pull in the direction, and then I'm going to come back this way to get some more skewing. The faster you move, the more distortion will take place, or the more extreme the distortion. It's almost like light painting if you've ever done a long exposure photograph. Now let's combine moving back and forth, and you'll see that things come in and out, and you'll have sort of these smaller versions of the edges coming in and out. So away, and then towards, away, towards, away, towards, away, towards, away, towards, away. And this one's a little bit more chaotic, and it's also a little bit harder to track, at least for me, as I'm working. So, those are the basics of using a scanner and moving an object to manipulate what the object looks like. In the case of an animation, you have to do these incrementally to distort things in a way that when you play them back in sequence, it will appear to grow and shrink, but incrementally, so it's lively. So I'm going to do a number of these just incrementally going down, and then I'm going to start them lower down. And so it's how it's functioning is basically I'm imagining that there's like a point here and a point here to start off with, just where it is, and then a point here and a point here. And I want to, as the sensor is moving across, move this from point A to point B. And then I want to increase that start point and end point each time incrementally until I've covered the whole thing. Then I want to start to decrease the size of it in the scan. And to do that, I'll start at a lower point, and then a lower point, and a lower point until it's stationary at this section. So I'll probably do a time lapse of this, but I'll showcase the process. So let's start into it. Initially, no movement, stationary. You can use markers, like pieces of tape or something else, to make this a more perfect sort of action, but I tend to just do it by eye and recognizing, or even using visual markers that aren't affixed to the scanner to reference where I'm at. So now I'm going to just move it a little bit. And then reset. And then this time we'll move it a little bit further down. And then we'll increase the distance covered. And then increase the distance. And this will be the last one where we're starting in the same position. And now we'll begin a little bit lower down. And what this will do is it'll squash out and then squash down. So starting a little bit lower, but aiming to arrive at the same destination. Now we'll start a little bit lower than that last time. And a little bit lower. And I'm not moving it until the sensor arrives at the front end, just because there's not really a point. It won't affect the image at all. And now I'll scan it once with it in this position. So now I'm going to start moving it against the direction. And I'm not resetting it initially because resetting in this case goes in the direction of the scan, which means that if I reset it too quickly, it'll be visible on the final scan. Something I didn't discuss earlier is the idea of twisting, because it's a little bit harder to grasp what's taking place. Because if you're moving in the direction or against the direction or uh, perpendicular to it, there's a little bit easier of an understanding because it's parallel or perpendicular. So you're only having one really big effect on what's taking place. But in the case of rotating an object with the flatbed scanner, you have essentially like half of the object that is moving towards the scanner movement and half that's moving away from the scanner movement. And so if you're rotating something clockwise in this case, this section is moving in the direction, so it's going to elongate, and this section is moving towards, so it's going to squash. So you're having contrasting things. So I'll show you what that looks like. And begin rotating. And so you can see it's something that's a little bit harder to grasp what's taking place, because when you're moving in this direction, you think about the trails you're moving against, you think about it squashing. But in the case of twisting it, rotating it, you have a different effect entirely because you're both moving with and against it. And you'd imagine that it would leave like trails behind because you're typically, at least for me, thinking of movement and time as being, if you move something, there's the echo, the residual elements of that movement that are a reflection of the movement itself. But in the case of this, it's scanning across, and so you're not recording it in a way that's reflective of the movement. I think that's most of the basics of how this sort of animation process works. You do incremental changes with an understanding of what the movement effects will have on the final scan, and it just takes practice, patience, and making a number of mistakes along the way. I'm just going to do a few scans to get some more distortion happening, and you can track visually what's happening with the movement, and then I'll jump off. So for this one, I'm going to move and twist and do some other things. Something to consider with more movement is sometimes the distortion gets to a point where it doesn't really read as easily. All right, I should move my hand a little bit here. The faster and more extreme the movements, the more distorted the images, and sometimes that's to your advantage and sometimes it's against. So like if you're doing something super chaotic like this, it doesn't have as clear of a reference to the original object as if you move slower and a little bit more consistently. It's just a learning process, really, and experimenting. So with any of these motions and scans and such, if you're wanting to use it for animation, it's just a matter of doing it incrementally to create these very distorted images that then can play back in a manner that gives the illusion of motion. And that altogether is how you make slit scan animation using a flatbed scanner.